Good evening. I'm Gary Giddins, the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, now in our 7th year, and we welcome you to what I think will be a very exciting discussion. I do want to point out that in addition to our regular public programs, the Leon Levy Center hosts a residential fellowship competition to fund the research and writing of outstanding biographies. There are leaflets in the lobby about our current fellows and information if you want to apply or know someone who does, and you can always contact our program director, Michael Gately, if you have any questions about that. I am pleased this evening to be joined by A. Scott Berg, whose remarkable career as a biographer began more than 40 years ago when he was a student at Princeton, and he wrote his senior thesis on the editor Max Perkins. Over the next 7 years, he expanded it into a breakthrough biography, Max Perkins, Editor of Genius, which created renewed interest in Perkins and much anticipation for forthcoming works by Scott Berg. He has since published highly regarded and best-selling biographies of Samuel Goldwyn, Charles Lindbergh, and most recently Woodrow Wilson, as well as a memoir of his 20-year friendship with Katharine Hepburn. He has won many awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. Woodrow Wilson, Scott's boyhood hero and one of the monuments of his alma mater, Princeton University, is the subject of perhaps his most ambitious work to date, for which he had access to 2 new archives containing many thousands of letters, often of a candidly personal nature. It has been widely praised for the originality of the portrait and the capaciousness of his method. One reviewer called it breathtaking. Wilson is now available in paperback and in our lobby. Wilson himself was a biographer. Scott Berg writes that Wilson's 1897 biography of George Washington was, and I quote, his poorest literary effort, under-researched and overwritten. It adopted a foppish tone that did nothing to Americanize or even humanize the first president. No one will ever say that of Scott Berg's portrait of the 28th president. Please join me in welcoming to the Leon Levy Center, Scott Berg.
Thank you. Thank you. But other than that, I really liked his book. Yeah. Yeah, some of his other books I definitely liked. Yeah.
I want to begin by talking a little bit about your background. I want to talk a little bit about you, and I know you come from Connecticut.
Oh, great.
And you went to school at Princeton.
I did. I was born in Connecticut, but my parents moved to California in the late 50s, so I was in elementary school when we moved out to LA, and that's where I grew up.
And you've been there ever since?
Been there ever since, except for my 4 years in New Jersey for college. Yeah, and I love living there. I love writing there. It's very conducive, I think, for doing writing.
And one of the things that brought you to Princeton was a love of Scott Fitzgerald.
Well, yes, it was a deep love of Scott Fitzgerald. When I was 15 and in the 11th grade, we had to do the obligatory American Authors Report. And it was at this point that I came home to discuss the fact with my parents that I had to do this assignment and that I really couldn't come up with an American author to write about. And my father promptly said, that's because you've never read one, which wasn't to suggest I had read widely in the European authors either. I had not read. I was a television idiot. And my mother then said, you know, you were actually named for Scott Fitzgerald, because in my final weeks of pregnancy with you, I was reading a biography, The Far Side of Paradise, the first book about Scott Fitzgerald, Arthur Meisner. And it was being serialized at the time, and she spent her last few weeks reading Fitzgerald novels, and she said, you were named for him, you're Scott, you know, so there you are. And I began to read for the first time about Scott Fitzgerald, and I began to read for the first time. It was the first time the light bulb went off over my head, and from that minute onward, I remember I went to the bookshelves in the house, which I barely knew existed, mostly because the television was in that room. But there were all of Scott Fitzgerald's novels, This Side of Paradise, Beautiful and Damned, Gatsby, Tender's the Night, and Last Tycoon. And I went right to Gatsby first, of course, because it's the skinniest. And I sat down and read it in one sitting, and from that minute on, I was a goner.
See, if you had started with The Beautiful and Damned, nothing might have happened.
Might not have been. You are so right, although I ended up loving that too.
Yeah.
And so by the time I graduated from high school, I had literally read every word by and about F. Scott Fitzgerald in the English language, starting with my high school library, the public library, the UCLA library, and so his poster was on the wall. This very same year, my mother read a biography of Woodrow Wilson called When the Cheering Stopped by Gene Smith, which was the first book to talk about the very active role the second Mrs. Wilson had in running the White House after he had suffered his stroke. And so up went Woodrow Wilson's poster on my wall. And then I had a third one up there, Adlai Stevenson, who was a great hero of mine, who died that year. And then I had a fourth poster who was Don Quixote. And there they all were. They were all tragic idealists, right. Deeply romantic figures. I was heavily into that. And it occurred to me by senior year in high school, they had all gone to Princeton, except for Don Quixote,
right.
who I am told had terrible board scores.
Right.
And that's why he didn't get in.
His eyesight didn't help.
Yeah.
So your name, your published name, A. Scott Berg, is an homage?
Totally homage. And my name is, Scott is my middle name. Mm-hmm. So I always use Scott, but you always had to fill out the box, what's your first name? So by and large, I am A.
So you went to Princeton.
I did.
And apparently your life was pretty much changed by Carlos Baker. Now, we're pretty much the same age, and I remember Carlos Baker was a critic, and I certainly remember when his Hemingway biography came out. It was a very big deal. It was the first book on Hemingway. It was a major, really a major work of literary biography, one of the few since, I guess, Elman's Joyce and Edell's James that really had the kind of impact that one had.
It had the impact in large measure, not only because it's a really wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, I still think it stands as the finest work on Hemingway. But it had, in addition to impact, it had the imprimatur of Hemingway himself. Before Hemingway died, he said to his wife, his fourth wife, Mary, when I die, I wish you destroy all the papers, this, that. I don't want anyone to go through them. I don't want anyone to write about me unless you can go to that professor at Princeton, Carlos Baker, who had written the only book of literary criticism about Hemingway that he approved of. And anyway, needless to say, she did go to Carlos Baker, who then spent the better part of a decade writing Hemingway's life story.
What was he like?
Carlos Baker?
Yeah.
He was a magnificent human being. Rather like Max Perkins, and my editor once said of Max Perkins, if Max Perkins had become a plumber, he would have become the world's greatest plumber, and people would have written books about that, because it was his character. And that's what Carlos Baker had as a teacher, as a professor. I went to him the beginning of sophomore year when I had this idea to write about Max Perkins. From the minute I set foot on the Princeton campus, the second day I was there, I went to the library, Firestone Library, where the Scribner archives, all of F. Scott Fitzgerald's archives, were housed. And I began to go through these papers. Literally, my second day on campus, I'm 17 years old. I just couldn't inhale it quickly enough, because, I've given you a glimmer of how interested in Fitzgerald I was. But imagine walking into this library, and there is the original first draft in pencil of The Great Gatsby. Mm-hmm. There are galley proofs with his corrections, and there are his liquor bills. It was just so much stuff. When I had finished going through all the Fitzgerald papers, I began to go through all the Scribner archives, they having gone to Princeton since the 1840s. So they had given all their papers. So therein were every letter Maxwell Perkins had ever received from Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Woolf, Ring Lardner, James Jones, Taylor Caldwell, Erskine Caldwell, the list is famous. Also, carbon copies of every letter he ever sent to those authors. And I began to go through those, and one day I thought, oh my God, this is the story that hasn't been told. And so I went to Carlos Baker's office, he having just published the Hemingway, and I knocked on his door and said, Professor Baker, I have a great idea for a book, and I'm wondering if you might support me in this. And he said, fatefully, it is a great idea for a book. In fact, he said, Max Perkins is the great enigma of American literature. The question, Scott, is whether you can do that book, as you are now a sophomore in college.
Right.
And by the way, he said, have you ever read Thomas Wolfe? And I said, oh, no, I haven't. My father always wanted me to read him, but there's all this thick, how am I going to ever read that? And I went back to the library, checked out the 4 Thomas Wolfe books, and disappeared for 2 weeks and just read them straight through and fell in love. And then Baker proceeded to work. Baker's advice was, he said, look, write a book, sure, but why don't you begin with a senior thesis, which you must do to get a diploma here,
right,
which your hero F. Scott Fitzgerald did not do. So why don't you do that? If you're still interested, turn it into a book. If you're not, you've spent your time wisely on a thesis.
How long was the thesis?
The thesis was 250 pages. The English department required, and actually required no more than 75 pages. You could do 50 to 75, and I had to get permission, actually, to turn in a 250-page thesis. And when they passed it back, they said, well, they gave me a prize, and they gave me an A+, and they gave me 4 pages of single-space notes saying this isn't really a senior thesis. It's really the first draft of the book, and we hope you will do that. What they forgot to tell me is it'll take another 7 years.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Why did they not tell me?
No.
Why did it take 7 years?
Why did it take?
Well, because I had done I had done all the Fitzgerald stuff, and I had gone through a large part of the Scribner archives. While all this was going on, the Scribner family is giving more and more papers, some of which hadn't even been cataloged yet at Princeton. And I wanted to see them, but they wouldn't let me into those papers because they said, we haven't cataloged them yet. And I said, look, I'll make a deal with you. Somebody's going to have to start breaking this stuff down. Why don't you let me go through it first, free labor, and I will divide everything into folders for you, taking notes madly as I'm doing that. You get all this free archival work, and I get to do my research. Well, that's what I did for a while. I should also add one more thing about Carlos Baker. While he was researching his book, Mary Hemingway, then the widow Hemingway, had given him all of Hemingway's papers. They were sitting in his office.
So you had access.
Under lock and key. So he said, look, I'll make a deal with you. If you don't tell Mary Hemingway, you can come to my office any day, and I will give you 1 folder of papers. When you finish with it, we can exchange folders. And he said, God help you if Mary Hemingway hears that I'm doing this. And she didn't hear about it. And I was like a drug addict, rapping on his door every afternoon just to get the next folder. And so he and I and Hemingway were basically the only people who had ever been through this archive. It's fabulous.
Yeah.
That's the kind of man he was.
Before you wrote this book, Perkins was a legendary figure. I mean, everybody had heard of him. I'm surprised that nobody else had ever.
Well, he was a legendary figure among the literati, and certainly among those who were Wolfe aficionados. You'd be surprised how few people knew who Max Perkins was. So that was one factor. I will tell you, though, in line with what you just said, I used to rush to the New York Times book review every Sunday just to see not only if there wasn't a book out on Max Perkins, but the author's queries that they used to publish, looking for anybody who knows anything about Max Perkins. And fortunately, all that time there wasn't.
So that makes me want to skip ahead, be a little discursive here, but
Good.
After you started Wilson, a major Wilson biography came out.
Oh, after I started, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, by that time, frankly, I didn't care. At that point, I had a number of books under my belt. I had whatever reputation I had. I discussed this with my publisher, in fact, and I said, look, you know, with Perkins, with Goldwyn, with Lindbergh, I had unique access. I had archives nobody had ever seen. And with Hepburn, of course, I had unique access to her herself. And I said, with Wilson, it's all there on the public record. It's public domain. And my publisher, Phyllis Gran, said, I don't care. I'm selling you as much as I'm selling Wilson. I'm selling your version of Wilson. So just carry on.
This was it Cooper?
Yes.
John Milton Cooper?
Yes, who's been writing about Wilson for 50 years, 40 years.
Did you read his?
I still haven't read it to this day. Mostly because if there was ever a problem, I wanted to be able to go to court and put my hand on a Bible and say, there's no way I took anything out of this book because I've never read it. That said, the minute I started my Wilson book, I always knew what I wanted the opening to be and what I wanted the closing to be.
Right.
So I did go to a bookstore, and I
To make sure he didn't do that. Yeah.
flipped to the end,
Right.
and I thought, oh, that's no good. He's got nothing on me here. So I'll stick to my opening and closing, which I did.
But even if you do take something and you source it, it's still legitimate.
Still legitimate, but just, you know that and I know that, but is the reader in Peoria going to know that? You know, he'll say,
Is
"Oh,
the
I just
reader
read
in
this."
Peoria reading two biographies
Yes,
of
maybe.
Woodrow Wilson?
Well, yeah, maybe not. But
Now, going back to Princeton for a second, you were considering becoming an actor.
I was, yes. Yeah, by the end of my junior year, I was doing a lot of extracurricular song and dance, literally and metaphorically, to the point that I was missing a couple of classes here and there. I was a member of the Princeton Triangle Club, which F. Scott Fitzgerald had written for and performed in, as had Edmund Wilson, I might add. Hard to imagine. But I was very active in that, and one of the great elements of the Princeton Triangle Club one of the great features, was that the show would go, this was a student-composed and performed musical every year, an original musical. And one of the features was that we would tour for 3 weeks every year, and one of the stops was New York City. And my junior year, we played in Lincoln Center at Alice Tully. And at the end of the show, I had 3 agents backstage who said, we're here to sign you up. 2 in particular who said, we do want to sign you, we can get you work, but you have to start next week. We're not going to have you go back to school.
Right.
Well, that was quite a phone conversation with my parents, wasn't it? And, well, I'll tell you, to this day, this relates to Carlos Baker, you were asking about him. It was then Christmas vacation, so I had that time to think about it. And my parents said to me, why don't you go back to school and discuss it with Carlos Baker? Because, you know, you've started all this research on Max Perkins. You kept saying you wanted to do a book. Why don't you see what he says? Now, to this day, I do not know whether my parents called Carlos Baker or
warned him.
And I don't want to know.
Right.
But I did see Carlos Baker, and he said to me, look, Scott, you're really onto some good work here with Max Perkins. If you really have all this talent on the stage, it's not going to go away in a year. Why don't you do what Scott Fitzgerald didn't do, and that's get a diploma.
Right.
And then you've always got your fallback, academia, and then go out and act. And of course, I carried on doing my thesis and then went on to write the book. I can safely say, though, if I had become an actor, you all could probably see me tonight performing in Man of La Mancha at a dinner theater in Akron, Ohio. I was a really good college performer.
Right.
Period.
Okay. Now, the Perkins book was an enormous success. I mean, it was really a remarkable debut. It just
Certainly for a
woke up.
27-year-old, 28-year-old.
Well, for anyone, really. It was a hell of a thing. At some point, did you decide then that you were going to be a biographer?
I'll tell you what I decided. When I was writing this book, because I had had, well, no training, no writing experience really, other than writing for the Princeton Triangle show, I worked like a maniac on that book. I literally worked 7 days and nights a week. I would usually take the last 3 days of each month off. I hated Februaries, but that's what I did for 7 years because I wanted to be able to say, knowing that this was an incredible idea for a book, I wanted at the end to be able to look in the mirror and say, I gave this the best I could. And I remember discussing this with my parents just before the book was published, because my parents said, what if it's no good? And I said, you know what, if it's no good, I can look myself in the mirror and say, I did the best I could. Clearly, I'm not a writer. Nobody could have worked harder on it than I did. The fact that it did work had encouraged me to carry on. When I was 2 years into the writing of this book, I began to think, because I was loving doing it, wouldn't it be interesting to write not just one book, not one biography, but what about a shelf full of biographies of 20th century American cultural figures, which had been my great passion. And I began to discuss with myself, wouldn't it be great to do 6 books, say? Each subject would be from a different part of the country, each would be from a different wedge of the great apple pie.
A larger plan, a collection of objectively told life stories of great American cultural figures of the 20th century, each representing a different wedge of the apple pie.
Gosh, what genius said that? And when?
I don't know when, but
I probably said it back then.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been my plan really since I was 23, and here we are.
But you didn't immediately have a second subject in mind?
I didn't have a second subject. And it was serendipitous, actually, because upon the publication of Max Perkins, I got a phone call from a man in Los Angeles whom I didn't know, Samuel Goldwyn Jr., who said, do you know who my father is? Samuel Goldwyn Sr., I guessed. And he said, yes, what do you know about my father? I grew up in a show business family, so I knew a fair amount about Goldwyn, at least what the average Hollywood person knew. And he said, listen, before my father died, he made me promise 2 things, that I would find a biographer for him, and that the biographer could not begin until he was dead. That is, the old man was dead, because he wanted the book to tell the truth, and he didn't want to be around when the truth was published. Very smart man, Sam Goldwyn. So, Junior said to me, you're in New York now, why don't you come back to LA where I know you live, I know you grew up in the movie industry, maybe you should look over the archives and see what I've got. My first reaction was that even though it filled my little checklist of where I wanted to go next, I thought, do I really want to take on a Hollywood figure? Because there's just so little supporting evidence to tell these stories. You know, it's all made up by these buccaneers who lied about everything.
And their publicists.
And their publicists, mostly. Yeah, exactly, because they couldn't write it all. The publicists wrote it all. And I did go out home to LA, and I met with Sam Goldwyn Jr. He gave me he gave me the key to a padlock of a fur and storage vault in the middle of Hollywood. Lions moving in storage, 6 stories high, up top floor. And I went into this room, and I still remember the feeling, which was, it was like Carter entering Tut's tomb. And I looked around, and there was just this very large room, completely surrounded with file cabinets. And I just began to pull drawers open at random. The first drawer had Sam Goldwyn, then named Sam Goldfish, a glove salesman, having been a glove maker, who wanted to go into the movie business. The first person he called on, figuring I know nothing about movies, who knows more about movies than anybody in the world, was Thomas Edison. Go to the man who invented motion pictures. And then I opened the last drawer, and there was the phone book, the phone sheet that Goldwyn's secretary kept of every incoming phone call. And I went and I saw the last phone call recorded before Sam Goldwyn had a stroke and died.
At 94.
At 94, although he said he was 91. They lie. But the last phone call was from Warren Beatty. So I thought, I have now walked in a room with the primary source documents of Hollywood from Thomas Edison to Warren Beatty.
Right.
That's an irresistible book. I've got to write it.
You know, I came across the line where you said at some point in an interview that you didn't initially want to write the book because you wanted to write about American culture, not Hollywood, which is an amusing line. But then I started to look, and you are so Hollywood connected. Your father, Richard Berg, was a film and TV producer and writer. You, for a while, were going to be an actor. Before you wrote Goldwyn, you wrote the story for a film called Making Love.
I did.
You did Goldwyn, you did Kate Remembered. Your brother is a CEO of ICC.
Or ICM. He was,
excuse
yes,
me.
formerly. Yes,
Your partner is a film producer,
he
Kevin
is.
McCormick.
And that's a lawfully wedded spouse now.
Ah, congratulations.
We're in the 2000, the California 2008, 18,000. Yep, film producer.
And you apparently are now working on a film version of 77 Sunset Strip.
Well, I have sold that idea to redo that television program. But if you really want to get Hollywood about it, my Wilson book has been optioned by Leonardo DiCaprio. So we are developing that. My Lindbergh book is now being, the screenwriter is working as we speak, I hope, on a miniseries.
Is this Spielberg?
Well, Spielberg bought it and never made it. So it's been sitting on a shelf. And my other half, Kevin McCormick, and Leonardo's company again, and I have resuscitated it at Paramount Studios, who does own the property now. And so Lance Black, who wrote Milk and J. Edgar, among other things, is now writing the screenplay. And my Max Perkins book has been filming for 4 days now.
Good Lord.
With Colin Firth playing Max Perkins, and Jude, yes, thank you very much, thank you. Yes, here for Colin, and Jude Law playing Thomas Wolfe. We have a wonderful cast.
Is he tall enough?
He's, well, we'll put him on, but we've got Laura Linney and Nicole Kidman, and we have a wonderful cast, Guy Pearce, Dominic West. So.
Let me ask you something about the legality. Because all of these stories are public domain, could they have circumvented you?
Technically, they could have. It's generally not done, especially when there's a big biography that sort of put the person and the information out there.
Right.
You can't copyright facts, so you'd be correct legally to ask that question. But it's really bad form, and along the way they would hire me, you see, as an advisor or a producer, as they have in all three instances. So to keep me as an active participant, they basically use my book as a source, and it's also, it gives the book some, the movie some credibility to say based on the book by. So yes, they could have, but it's seldom done where they circumvent the biographer.
Going back to the Goldwyn book, I think that the final feeling that you get after reading it is that there's a lot of courage there. There's a lot to admire, especially about his walk from Asia to the United States.
From Warsaw,
and also his stand with HUAC and some of the other things that he was really the patron saint of independent filmmaking.
He was it.
But there is this long section in which he is the most unpleasant figure.
Yeah.
I reviewed the book when it came out, and I said, possibly in fact or fiction. Just dreadful. Did Junior object to any of this?
Well, isn't it interesting? Junior really wanted me to write that book.
Right.
And it wasn't just because he had promised his father. I think Sam Goldwyn Jr., to his great credit, really wanted to tell the story. And I don't think he would mind my saying, but I interviewed Samuel Goldwyn Jr., I mean, proper interviews. I think I probably did 20 interviews with him. They were 2-hour sessions. They were generally in his office, where he had a couch, and I would generally be sitting in a chair, and he'd be sitting on the couch, and I would pull out my pad, and I would say, so now tell me about your mother. And we would talk, and after about 2 hours, he's now lying down on the couch. And so it went, and they became truly analytical sessions. And he really did want it told. When the book was published, he read a lot of deeply personal and some very horrible things about his father. And I remember vividly, he said, where did you get that story about? And I said, Sam, you told it to me. Don't you remember? He said, oh my God, I blocked out telling you. And he said, I thought I had blocked it out anyway. But
One of the strange things in the book, you mentioned Goldwyn's wife.
yes.
And she's certainly strange,
Yes.
a strange figure. And she has herself and Sam buried along with George Cukor. Now, George Cukor was a famously gay film director
Yes.
who says that if things had been a little different, I would have been Junior's father.
Yes, he did say that. He said that to me. Yes.
And what do you make of that?
Well, I make of that Frances Howard Goldwyn was not a deeply sexual creature. She was an aspiring actress, much younger than Sam Goldwyn, who had divorced his first Jewish wife, had a daughter whom he disowned, one of the horrible things.
Is this the potato daughter?
The potato, yes. They had
okay.
a fight when she was about 13 years old over how a baked potato was cooked at a restaurant. He created such a scene. She was so humiliated, and she said something, and basically he said, I will never speak to you again. And that was the case for decades. They did speak in the end. But now Sam Goldwyn is a free man, doesn't have a child to worry about, paid off the first wife, doesn't have a wife to worry about, meets this very pretty young actress, courts her, immediately wants to marry her. She doesn't know what to do. Sam Goldwyn, to put it kindly, was not a beauty, and she was, but she wasn't much of an actress. And anyway, she went to her best friend, the director, George Cukor, who was gay, whom they knew from the theater, a stock company in Rochester, New York, and he was her best friend. And she went running to him and said, George, Sam Goldwyn just proposed to me. What should I do? And he said, Frances, you will never get a better part. Marry him. And that's what she did, and she paid for it. She paid dearly, but at the same time, she was the grande dame of Hollywood for 40 years.
Right.
She was, had the #1 dinner table in Hollywood, so she got so much of what she wanted, and it was a real devil's pact. So that is why it was in her will that when she was buried, George Cukor was to be buried next to her, along with Sam Goldwyn on the other side, who was, after all, her husband, and frankly had paid for the gravesite.
Right.
And indeed, when George Cukor died a few years later, and I got to know him rather well among the 150 people I interviewed for that book, the body was not even cold when Sam Goldwyn Jr. swooped right in and got the body and said, I know where he's being buried, and whoosh, there he is.
Your immediate predecessor at the Leon Levy Center was a writer we both admire, Richard Holmes.
There are a few I admire more. He's one of my gods.
Indeed. And you have quoted a line from Footsteps in the Wall Street Journal a year or two ago about finding points of identification as an essential motive for attempting to recreate the journeys of someone else's life through the physical past. If you are not in love with them, you will not follow them, not very far anyway. That's Holmes speaking.
That's Holmes, yeah.
And how has this worked for you? Do you find yourself loving the people you've written about?
Loving some aspect, anyway. I could say that my feelings for Max Perkins were pretty pure love. I mean, he was such a noble creature, and he literally changed the course of the American river of literature. So that's lovable. Sam Goldwyn, I mean, I did not love him, and I'm not sure anybody really did, at least unqualifiedly. Lindbergh, a very cold fish. I'm Jewish. Lindbergh was purportedly anti-Semitic. That was tough to cozy up to. Wilson, I had great teenage feelings for, so he was still kind of a heartthrob for me, but there's certainly a lot about him that isn't lovable. All that being said, I look for elements that I do love, or if not love, certainly deeply admire. In the case of Sam Goldwyn, how could I help but admire this semi-literate teenage runaway from Warsaw who comes to America with no money? He had a few dollars in his pocket, which he had stolen in Europe to get across. And 15 years later has invented something we now call Hollywood and became one of the half-dozen moguls who not only created an art form, but an industry. And so that, to me, was extremely admirable. And
He did it without a studio.
Sorry, without a studio. He was it. He was Samuel Goldwyn Studios. I mean, he helped start what became MGM, but got kicked out because he was not a very pleasant man. He helped start Paramount Studios, got kicked out because he was not a very pleasant man. Helped start United Artists, got kicked out because, you know, he wasn't a very pleasant man. But I feel my job is not necessarily to make you like the subject, but to make you understand the subject and maybe empathize, if not sympathize. And I found, and this was the hook for me, and it's kind of a substitute for having to love my subject, is make you feel for the subject, such that the moments where Sam Goldwyn is most horrible, for example, I try to write it in such a way that you can see these are the moments he is truly in the deepest pain. And for a reader with any heart or mind to read that, I think it wins you over. And you say, my God, this is a tortured soul, and yet you couldn't keep him down. He goes on and starts another studio and starts another picture and just keeps, you know, he's relentless. So I found that a great life's journey. And the same thing with Lindbergh in many ways. And then Wilson, well, Wilson's life is just so full of pathetic drama.
We'll go there. I'm just thinking, Goldwyn had a serious problem with being Jewish. He named his son Junior and kept him away from every aspect of Judaism, and made Danny Kaye dye his hair blonde because as a redhead he looked too Jewish.
Too Jewish, the nose looked too long and all that. And let's not forget, he changed his name from Shmuel Gelbfish to Samuel Goldwyn. Well, I mean, you know, Goldwyn sure doesn't sound Jewish.
Right.
You know?
Lindbergh. We talked about this on the phone over a year ago. I had just learned about the multiple families that he had in Germany that you did not know about when you wrote the book.
Correct.
And we talked a little bit about how you were going to deal with this, but I think you need to fill in the story. I mean, you publish a book that is a huge success. It wins you the Pulitzer Prize. You make a point of saying that Lindbergh was basically faithful to Anne Morrow, who is not herself faithful, and then you find out, tell us about this.
Yes, and actually what I say in the book, I do reveal a woman in the Philippines he had been sleeping with, actually. And I remember when I gave the manuscript of my book to the 5 Lindbergh children here in America who were the children of Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. And I gave it to the children, you know, to check for errors. And one of the sons called me up and said, Scott, I think everything's great. We're all on board, blah, blah, blah. But you have one thing in this book that is simply a falsehood or a mistake. I don't know what. But you have my father sleeping with this woman in the Philippines. It simply did not happen. It could not happen. My father gave us lectures all the time on you must always remember with whom you're having sex with and and the mixing of blood and you know So anyway, I said, all I can say is I have enough sources to support it. I stand by it. It's going there. Now, the book gets published. About, well, a few months later, I learned that somebody is trying to contact me in Germany. Somebody in Germany, rather, is trying to contact me. And finally, I get a call from the New York Times that said there's a story that's trying to break over here in Germany of a woman claiming to be Charles Lindbergh's daughter with a German woman here. And what do you know about this? I said, I know nothing about this. Can you put me in touch with anybody to discuss it? And he said, well, I can tell you what I've been given by these people. And they have letters from Charles Lindbergh that seem to support the story. I said, can you fax one of them to me? And as it was coming out of my fax machine, I said, oh my God, that's Charles Lindbergh's writing. So, I mean, it was clearly something had gone on. Now, I subsequently hear from the daughter who said, and here's the story, Charles Lindbergh had initially 2 families over in Germany, which nobody knew about, starting in the 50s and into the 60s. To make it a little more intriguing, the 2 women with whom he had these families are sisters. Yeah, the plot really thickens. Now, so we've got that going on. Now, one of the daughters from one of those families now finally reaches me and said, we promised our mother we would never discuss this, that we were Charles Lindbergh's children. But your book came out, I read your book, I just couldn't take it another day. And I just need you at some point to look me in the eye and say, yes, you are Charles Lindbergh's child. I don't want money, I don't want fame, but I want acknowledgement that my brothers and I are Lindbergh's children. We subsequently met because now they went to the press with the story, so it's been put out there. And we had kind of a secret meeting in the back bar of a hotel in Paris where she was living. And as I walked into this hotel, this woman came running or walking toward me, and I said, oh my God, that looks like Reeve Lindbergh, the youngest of Charles and Anne's children. Ooh, Reeve Lindbergh 20 years ago. And then she said, I have my brothers here. And then I said, oh, that looks like Lan Lindbergh, and that looks like John Lindbergh. Oh, 20 years ago. And I didn't need a DNA test. I mean, this was Charles Lindbergh walking at me. And we began to discuss this and to piece the story together. And what I think happened, and nobody will ever know because Lindbergh left massive archives that took me 2 years to get through. There is not a trace of any of this. He clearly had taken out anything that might pertain to these families. But what I believe happened, and what I say in the book, in the mid-50s, Anne Morrow Lindbergh had an affair with her doctor, a famous New York doctor named Dana Atchley. In fact, there's a wing of Columbia Presbyterian named after him. And I say in the book, Charles Lindbergh either knew about this and chose not to do anything or chose not even to pay attention to this affair that was going on. But I think in that moment, Charles Lindbergh, who had been faithful all his life, and indeed he was a virgin when he got married, and Lindbergh was the first girl he had ever gone out with, first woman he had ever kissed. So I believe in that moment, something kind of snapped in him, that this rock, Anne, that he had always depended on, was, in his mind, having an affair. I think he figured what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And now, at the same moment, for the first time, Charles Lindbergh, the most recognizable man on earth, for the first time, he was not easily recognizable. He had lost his hair, he had put on some weight, so he had a little belly. You know, he could now stand at the train station, nobody knew who he was, and now he travels around the world a great deal, and for the first time he's anonymous. And I think for the first time he was 25 again before his flight.
But these aren't affairs. These are like bigamous.
Well, these are, yes, yes, they are families. And I should add, there is a third family over there in Europe as well. And in fact, Reeve Lindbergh, upon learning of all this, said to me, you know, there really should be plaques all over Europe that say Charles Lindbergh slept here and here and here. Yeah. Well, these were families. Now, to play it backwards, Charles Lindbergh's father, who was a congressman, had a second family in Washington. Not a family, he had a second life in Washington. There was a woman he had a relationship with. And this I mentioned in my book. Also, Charles Lindbergh's grandfather, was having, well, he had a double life. He had been a politician in Sweden, had gotten into some political trouble, and at the same time had gotten a waitress in Stockholm pregnant. And one night, literally, you know, at midnight, they caught a boat to America. And Charles Lindbergh's grandfather left behind a wife and 5 children and came to America. And there, you know, sired the future congressman who sired Charles Lindbergh. So there is something in the family DNA, anyway. They are wanderers.
Okay, but now, this, I think for most of us, this is a nightmare for a biographer. It's, of course, ex post facto. You know, I mean, it's kind of an, I mean, it was never a nightmare. It was, you know, I wished I had had it. So what do you do about it, though?
Well,
do you
what
do
I
anything?
I'm still thinking about what to do, maybe, you know, for a reprint of the book, maybe to do an afterword and say, dear reader, by the way. And you can see in the book, actually, you know, there are a couple of moments where, for example, Anne Lindbergh is saying in the late 50s, where's Charles? You know, I'm in the hospital, I just had knee surgery, he said he was going to be here to take me home. Well, he's off in Germany, you know, with these other families. Or he almost missed one of his daughter's wedding in America, you know, missed one of his children's graduations, because he's got this other life going on. It was something nobody knew about.
Do you make anything of the fact that all these families are in Germany?
That they're all what?
In Germany?
Well, there's not, strangely, I don't think there's a lot to make of it. I mean, there was obviously the famous German connection. Lindbergh was accused of being a Nazi. He had 6 visits to pre-war Berlin. I don't think it was that at all. I mean, I think he felt comfortable in Germany. He certainly admired the German mind. But I don't think it was like, oh boy, I'm back among the Nazis, you know?
When you spend a decade or so on a biography, is the intention simply to say this is my version, or to do something that you think will be definitive, that will stand?
Well, both. I mean, I try to do that, certainly. I try to do both those things equally. And I still think, with the exception of these families, I still think it stands as the definitive biography, just because I'm the only one who's had all the resources,
right,
and the only one who has had access, well, certainly to all the American Lindberghs. So I think that will always keep it standing. When I think about, you know, it's been suggested maybe I should write a book about all, you know, the after story. And as I start to piece it together, I think it's really a magazine article at best, or as I said, an afterword. It's material that could easily fit into the main text of what I had, because there are those gaps where Lindbergh is simply missing. And he's officially doing business for the World Wildlife Fund or for Pan Am, for whom he was an advisor.
But it doesn't alter your basic sense of him?
It doesn't change too much for me, in that I think he was kind of a twisted guy, and I think you get that whole image from the book.
Yes.
Perhaps not as twisted as I now think he is. Right. So there's certainly that to be said. And we are certainly going to address it when we do this television miniseries. That will certainly be a feature of it.
This brings up a subject that we talk about a lot here at the Levy and Levy Center, and that is the limits of the knowable. And I imagine in everything you've done, and certainly everything that almost any serious biographer does, there are just moments when you are determined to find something and it just cannot be
Well,
found.
absolutely right. And I will tell you, I spent 20 years as Katharine Hepburn's friend, one of a handful of confidants. And we spent, I can't count the hours, sometimes weeks at a time together, in which she basically told me her life story. And more than once, she said to me, you can never know everything about another person. So for all the candor of our conversations, I knew there was so much she wasn't revealing, and I knew there was so much that I was getting her version, and if I talked to 3 other people, I would get quite different versions of her life or an event in her life. So yes, there is so much that is the unknowable. You know, Fitzgerald himself said biography is the falsest art. And of course he would say that being a novelist. But there's a lot of truth to that. And the best you can do is get to what I said in that early quote, you know, the most objective truth you can get to. So I enter into this saying I have no great agenda. I don't have some points I want to prove, and then I look for the evidence to support the points. And then I just do as much research as is humanly possible.
One of the reasons that we need to see new biographies of major figures every couple of generations is because different things about them seem to point to our time. A couple of obvious examples in Wilson. I think earlier biographers might not have been as interested in the fact that he interpreted the Second Amendment exactly the way it reads. It's about arming a militia. It does not allow you to conceal a weapon. It also, there was a lot of the things in terms of the Federal Reserve and taxation, a lot of this seems like it could be just folded into an Obama biography at some point. But I think the major issue, and it's always been there with Wilson, but maybe never quite as I don't know, anguished over as it is in your book, is the race
No question
issue.
about it.
And I have never read a complete Wilson biography before, so everything that I think I know about Wilson is pretty much from you.
Good, keep it that way.
And well, what fascinates me, a number of people have argued that you like him too much, or that you want the reader to like him too much. And I think that there are passages that justify that. On the other hand, I'm completely appalled by the character that you create, and especially on the race issue. It seems to me that he's one of those people who's almost messianic in his sense of purity, his moralism, and yet, like one of those Graham Greene Americans, he seems to create a lot of disasters.
I think there's truth to that. And I did try to be, I mean, I certainly admire Wilson a great deal. I think he is, well, he's certainly the most educated president we've had, and I believe he's the most idealistic. I think those are 2 wonderful qualities to have in a president of the United States, especially in what was then an extremely troubled moment in world history, and it's the first moment we come up on the stage, on the world stage there. So when it came to race, I tried to be, as with everything in the book, scrupulously fair. And the biggest thing I wanted to point out at the end of the day, especially for a modern reader 100 years after Woodrow Wilson, is that he was a centrist in his day. He was not a racist off to the far right. He was right down the middle in this country. You know, this was a period in which we had Klansmen proudly sitting in the United States Senate. They didn't hide this. This is how they got elected. We had Klansmen on the Supreme Court. Again, they weren't hiding it.
He put somebody close to being a Klansman.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you about that.
Didn't know that he was. I mean, he knew he was he didn't know the full extent of that guy, McReynolds.
McReynolds.
Yes, who had been a very active antitrust lawyer.
So he was, this fascinates me. He's initially considered, because of the antitrust cases to be something of a progressive.
Yes.
But it turns out he is not only a vicious racist, but he's an anti-Semite off the...
Absolute anti-Semite. He's one of the worst justices who's ever sat on the court, not just as a justice, but as a human being.
He leaves the room whenever Brandeis
And Brandeis would speak.
speaks.
And Wilson put Brandeis on the court, the first Jew to be put on a court. But whenever Brandeis would speak, McReynolds would either leave the room or just pull his newspaper up and start reading it. And you know, famously, there's a team picture each year of the Supreme Court. But once Brandeis was on the court and then Frankfurter, McReynolds would not sit in the same picture.
Right.
So, I mean, he was a mean cuss, you know.
But I find it difficult to believe that Wilson had no clue, no warning.
Well, he didn't really. And few did, and McReynolds got progressively or unprogressively worse as his term went on and on and
Until
on.
1939.
Yeah, I mean, he was there a long time.
Right.
But he was just a nasty piece of work. But what Wilson knew about him was that he was this trust buster. So that seemed to be the big thing. That was the litmus test for Wilson in that day.
One of the characters who's sort of circling around the Wilson presidency is Theodore Roosevelt, who
Yes.
comes off as something of a psychopath.
Well,
but at the end, Wilson becomes a little crazy.
in his own way.
With everybody?
Yes, he does. And actually, to be fair, I think he became clinically crazy. I mean, Wilson did have a major stroke in 1919, which left him not completely incapacitated, but paralyzed on one side. He could still speak and think. But as we now know about a lot of stroke victims, their whole chemistry goes wacky. His emotions were all over the place. His decision-making wasn't good. His memory wasn't good. And so, with all that, Wilson is saying and doing some crazy things. Now, what also happens with a lot of stroke victims is they become more entrenched in who they were. Now, Wilson was always a pretty stubborn character anyway, but now this is really tenfold. And opinions now become so hard and fast for Woodrow Wilson that the decision-making is sometimes almost lunatic.
His hatred of Eugene Debs.
The hatred of Eugene Debs, and I get where it's coming from, which was Debs basically was speaking out against the war, and for Wilson, bringing the United States into World War I was the hardest thing he had to do. He sent 2 million soldiers abroad. This almost killed him every night. And there are some passages in the book, and many more that I found. Wilson is the only president I know, or the one who most copped to his basically sending soldiers to their graves.
There's a memorable line in which he's applauded and cheered after giving this incredible speech about going to war, make the world safe for democracy, and he says, how could they be applauding? All I'm doing is sending boys to their death.
And he comes back to the White House and says that and puts his head down on a table and sobs. Now that story gets left out of all the Wilson biographies. To me, that is one of the biggest illustrations of his character you can possibly have. So here's Wilson carrying this burden every day, every night, and here's Eugene Debs, whom Wilson had rather admired, actually. And Debs is giving speeches, in essence, telling people, you know, this is a capitalist war and you don't have to go fight, and he is arrested for sedition. He is thrown in jail. And there he is. The war is now over. Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, no less an Attorney General than, well, than we know, yes, exactly, from Palmer, who initiated the Palmer raids. And now Palmer comes to the president and says, Mr. President, the war is over. Eugene Debs is an old man now. He's sick. He's still in jail. I recommend, just, for the unity of the country, that you give him a pardon. And I have even written up the pardon. And all you have to do is sign your name. And Woodrow Wilson pulls out his pen, leans over, and writes, denied. Whew, that's tough.
And then the person who does pardon him is Warren Harding, who actually invites him to the White House.
Yeah,
he wants to meet him.
That was just a smack in Woodrow Wilson's face. That was just to say, Woodrow Wilson, well, here's what, I don't need to say what he said.
The great controversy about the last year in the White House after he has the stroke is how much power did Edith, his second wife, the former Edith Galt, have. That seems to be an area where there's very limited real knowledge, other than the fact that she's basically protected who we saw.
Yes. It's somewhat limited what actual documents there are, because basically Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke while he was trying to sell the country on the League of Nations. He went on a 29-city tour of the country. Halfway across, he collapsed. After years of increasing arteriosclerosis, he was rushed back to the White House, where he suffered this stroke. And Mrs. Wilson and a handful of doctors kept this a secret from the world for a year and a half. Nobody knew the President of the United States had a stroke. In this period, I think it's the greatest conspiracy in American history. During this period, nobody could see the President, or nobody could get a document before the President that needed his signature without it going first through Edith Bowling Galt Wilson. So she is the one who, in essence, is deciding of the 1,000 things that cross the President's desk every day, which 3 or 4 he is going to decide upon. She then studies those issues and presents the case to her husband, the President, and says, I think you should sign this, or how do you feel about this? She never made a decision for the President, but she decided what he would decide upon. So in essence, she said she was merely a gatekeeper, but one could argue she was a little more than just a chief of staff. And as a result, one could reasonably argue that Edith Bowling Galt Wilson became the first female president of the United States, because for 18 months she ran the executive branch of the United States government.
You read her memoir, of course.
I did.
How trustworthy did you?
Oh, so not.
Not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so not. But it's kind of lovely. She's very trustworthy in describing interior decoration and clothes. I mean, she remembers exactly the bias of the cut of her dress, she's fabulous on that. Some of the stories get glorified a bit, some have little digs at people. So I use her as kind of a seasoning in my book. I mean, I never put something she said or thought as a piece of meat on the plate, but I will use her as paprika here and there,
My favorite shot, if I can use that filmic word, of Wilson in the book is when he thinks he's not being observed, he's dancing a jig and singing, "Oh, you beautiful doll," and then clicks his heels, which I would not have thought he was physically capable.
Exactly, he was, or emotionally capable.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I really wanted to do in this book, and that was to rewrite the really doer portrait we have, Woodrow Wilson, and he was those things. He was the Presbyterian minister's son and grandson. He had those elements. But he was also, I believe, the most deeply passionate man we've ever had in the White House. When he courted his 2 wives, the first wife having died in the White House, he exchanged, with the first wife, thousands of the most passionate love letters I've ever read.
Well,
They're unbelievable.
There's a third courtship, the first courtship with his cousin.
Yes, there is that, isn't there?
And you reproduce some of those letters.
Yes.
Yeah, but they're remarkable letters.
They are. They're incredible. I mean, yes, he did want to marry his first cousin. There was that. Well, that's kind of remarkable. Woodrow Wilson, you want to marry your cousin? Okay. And then Ellen Wilson, and then Edith. But love letters that are eloquent, romantic, sexual, intellectual, social, they're everything. And there they are, but I'm not exaggerating. There are thousands of Woodrow Wilson love letters. And I think that's perhaps the biggest surprise about this man, that he was capable of all this.
A couple of lines of Wilson speaking that sort of attest to some of this. Certainly the doer quality. I can't effervesce in the face of responsibility.
Man, that works for me.
I read detective stories to forget as a man would get drunk. He's frequently suffering from a clinical depression.
I think so, yes. And in fact, and this is an interesting aspect of biography, which is psychobiography, in which you may know the biographer psychoanalyzes, in essence, the subject. Well, Woodrow Wilson has the ultimate psychobiography because it was written by Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud basically didn't know Wilson, but he hated him from afar. And Freud had a friend and patient named William Bullitt, who had worked for Wilson and then later went on to work for Franklin Roosevelt. Rather brilliant man. But this man, Bullitt, also detested Woodrow Wilson. Now, Bullitt goes to Freud and says, Dr. Freud, if I gave you all the facts about Woodrow Wilson's life, all the facts as Bullitt gathered them, do you think you could analyze them? Which he does. And
the way he did Leonardo da Vinci.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And in the Freudian analysis of Woodrow Wilson, he identifies 10 to 13 moments of genuine clinical depression. Some of them are a little exaggerated, but the point does remain the same. I mean, there is definitely some truth to it. And there are certainly 3 or 4 major depressions in Wilson's life.
There's something else, you're saying 10 to 13. For hundreds of pages, every time Wilson does anything, he creates a constitution, he writes yes. a list. He's really trying to be in control of reality and by numbering it. So when he comes up with the 14-point, it's like, duh. You know, you're really inevitable. Sort of prepared for this.
Absolutely. Well, and that's something I, as the biographer, try to set up.
Right.
I mean, I know I'm going to have this big constitutional finale in which Woodrow Wilson has 14 points, the 14th being the creation of a League of Nations, which is basically a constitution for the world. So I thought, okay, I've got that to end with. Let's work backwards. And there I see, there's 9, 10-year-old Woodrow Wilson playing what wasn't Little League Baseball yet, but he had a little baseball team. And at that age, he writes a constitution for his baseball team. So we can now track, he's doing a constitution there, then he goes to college where he writes constitutions for the debating societies, and he does that at Virginia Law School. And then he does, you know, when he becomes governor of New Jersey, he's codifying the laws now again. And then as president of the United States, you know, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, he has the great constitution for the world.
2 terrible moments. One, you referred to this as the low point of the administration, the Palmer raids.
Yes.
Palmer violated every amendment in every facet of the Constitution. He just and had police doing whatever they wanted, breaking into people's homes.
They did.
You imply, I think, that Wilson didn't know?
I state he did not know. These raids happened after Wilson's stroke. He is in bed. He's upstairs in the White House, where the primary duty of the doctors and Mrs. Wilson and 1 or 2 nurses is to keep all stress from the President of the United States. So they basically didn't give him the newspapers. They would give him selected articles to read or give him memos. So it was at this moment the very ambitious Attorney General Palmer, who has presidential aspirations, says, I'm in charge here. And he seizes this moment to launch his raids.
Which is what happens with Wilson's great friend House, Colonel House.
Yes.
When he leaves him alone in Europe, and suddenly House thinks he's going to run
he's out of the box.
The Paris Peace Conference.
Yeah, he was a power-hungry guy. Nobody knew it. Colonel House was the great advisor to Woodrow Wilson. And he had a great understanding of foreign affairs, and he was a very good diplomat. But there he was over with Wilson, where he was always in the background. The minute Wilson came home for 3 weeks to do some business, and the president had left the country for 6 months. He's out of the country. But in this 3-week period, when he comes home to sign some legislation, Colonel House is suddenly in charge, and Wilson comes back, and basically Wilson thinks House has sold the ranch, has undone everything Wilson had spent the first 2 months doing. And from that moment on, he had a totally different feeling about Colonel House, but they have to work together, which they do up until June of 1919. And then Wilson is going to come back to America, which he does. He says goodbye to Colonel House at the train station in Paris. House is going to do some mopping up back there in Paris. They say goodbye. Woodrow Wilson gets on the train, goes home, never sees or speaks to Colonel House again.
And same with his other advisor, Tumulty.
Tumulty, who is his closest political advisor in the White House. Same with when Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton, his best friend, I mean, they were inseparable friends.
But he really did betray him.
Well, you know, this was a friend who stood up a trustee meeting, and Wilson wanted to do a certain thing for the college, and his friend didn't agree with it. And basically, from that moment on, they never spoke to each other again either.
The other incident, and if there's one supporting character in this book that I would love to read a biography of, and I looked it up, and the last one that came out about him was in 1970. It's William Monroe Trotter.
Oh, yes, well. Yes, well, this is one of the great African-American leaders of the day, and for all Wilson's twisted feelings on race, and they were, he always had the door open to African-American petitioners. And William Monroe Trotter was one of the outstanding African-American spokesmen in that day. But he came, Wilson and he had more than one encounter, but there was an ultimate one where Wilson just couldn't stand Trotter's attitude. And I think, and I put this in quotes, I think Wilson felt he was being uppity. And
oh yes, because the way you
I give you the transcript.
Give the scene, the transcript, everything he says is
really
logical,
okay.
Eloquent.
Yeah, it was all those things. And I think it was a moment where Wilson felt he was being backed in a corner. It was a little, well, it was a little like other moments in his life, like trying to keep out of the war and so forth. He was trying to keep out of the racial matter, you know, whether to integrate or segregate the federal offices in Washington. And he was really having a hard time dealing with it. And now here's this guy who is relentless with Wilson. And Wilson basically said, you have just set your cause back and you are not welcome in this house again.
Kicks him out. And then he says he had played the fool by losing his temper and he wished he hadn't. And I'm thinking, well, why doesn't he write him a conciliatory note? But he can't do that.
He would not do that.
He can't. He also at the time when Harvard and all the other schools are accepting some black students, he will not allow that at Princeton.
Yes. Now a lot of that, and again, you have to go back 100, or in the case of Princeton, you have to go back 125 years. And Princeton, although in New Jersey, was a very southern school, and this is why Wilson really did allow segregation in the federal offices. He said, I know the South. The South is not ready for this. Washington, D.C. was a small southern town in 1913, very southern, very small. There were still people, you have to remember, at this time there were still people who had fought in the Civil War.
Right.
A lot of them.
And yet somebody points out that the black women who were working had been eating with white women for 9 years.
A few in some places.
Right,
yes,
and then Wilson stopped that.
Yes, he did. Now, a big part of that is, just as Wilson took office, a contingent of Southern senators came to him and said, Mr. President, you have a very ambitious progressive agenda. It's going to take all hands on deck. You are not going to get a single Southern vote if you continue with this integration process. You've got to take it back to where it was before. And I think that was political expediency.
Now, one thing you do relieve him from historically that I don't think, I think it will always remain on the books, is the famous line about D.W. Griffith's film.
Yes.
You make a very persuasive case that Wilson never actually said the line that he's constantly being blamed with, that it's like history written in lightning. And for a historian, that is a bizarre...
Well, it's one of the great, I think it's the greatest movie review ever written, which was of D.W. Griffith's classic. It's an incredible film, The Birth of a Nation. It is also deeply racist, because the punchline of the movie is the Klan comes in to save the day. And there it is. Wilson is guilty of running that movie in the White House. He knew it would be controversial. But again, I tell you, this was the most popular movie of the day, and it's the most popular movie in American history for the next 50 years. You know, I don't think it was replaced until even Gone with the Wind and the Sound of Music, I think, finally...
Actually, 1928
was
a terrible movie called Sonny Boy.
Oh, yes.
That was the top grossing because it was the first Jolson movie to come out after all the theaters had switched to sound.
Yep. Although I think you'll find in dollar amounts if you adjust.
Could be.
Birth of a Nation in 1915 still had the greatest relative dollar amount. In any case, Wilson, according to reports, left the screening. He didn't even see the whole thing, and almost certainly did not say it is like writing history in lightning. And that is a phrase nobody that I found, and I looked hard for it, could trace where it actually came from.
So you suggest maybe Dixon,
I think Dixon himself,
the guy who
wrote the book that the movie is based on and was a huge self-promoter. I think he put it out there. He knew Wilson as a graduate student. And it also seemed to be a conflation of another remark made by the Chief Justice of the time. So I think all these things were put together, and then it was attributed to Wilson because, of course, he ran it in the White House, and of course, he was a racist, and so there you have it. I say, if you've never seen Birth of a Nation, you really ought to see it. It's a fascinating movie. And again, 100 years later, it's a kind of stomach-turning to look at some of it.
We've gone a little long. It's wonderful to talk to you. One last question. Do you have a subject?
I don't. Do you have one for me?
Yes, this guy Trotter.
Trotter, wait. Yeah, you know, I didn't like him all that much, I must say, Trotter. I mean, he was kind of a nasty piece of work, too, Trotter. I mean, he was a mixed bag. I'm in a funny position now because I am now just starting to look actively for my next subject. And now the dilemma is, do I stick to my apple pie? You know, I've written about somebody from the Northeast, from the West, from the Midwest, the South, and the various fields I've done. In a way, I've painted myself into a corner. I'm sort of down to a female mathematician from Seattle. You know, if I could just find her, and does she let me illuminate a bigger story? Or do I just give up the pie?
Alice Paul.
Well,
that's another great character.
Alice Paul is a great character. The reason I probably wouldn't write about her is there's so much overlap.
Right.
Because that's the other thing, too. I'm looking for arenas I haven't covered. Alice Paul is fascinating. She's a most worthy character. I'm not sure it's a lot of new research for me.
Right. And
that's half the fun for me.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Will you sign some books?
I'll be out front.
He will be happy to sign books. They're available in the lobby. Thank you.